Most problems are caused by solutions. For instance, hunter-gatherers struggled with the problem that in some years game was plentiful and in others hard to find. But they didn't worry about feeding the animals they hunted or protecting them from predators or keeping them from inbreeding. These weren't the hunters' business. But when the hunters became herders, domesticating the animals they ate and thereby solving the problem of game intermittency, they discovered that finding forage for their animals and managing and protecting them were problems very much theirs to cope with. Likewise, domestication of plants meant that one no longer needed to search the landscape for food. But then sowing, weeding, irrigating, seed-saving, pests, and a host of other issues arose. A surprisingly complex body of knowledge, most of it encoded in customs and traditions, had to be created to make agriculture work. And then there was still the problem of lean years, when floods or droughts or plagues destroyed the harvest. Storing grain in silos helped solve the problem of how to survive the years of poor harvest, but created the problem of how to keep track of whose grain was whose, and of how to ensure everyone got their fair share, and of how to protect it from hungry outsiders with no grain of their own, but a willingness to do violence to get yours. Writing, civil authority, and soldiery are born. Solving all these food problems meant having plenty. Having plenty meant growth. More people. More mouths to feed. More land wanted. Soon the writing and civil authority aren't enough. Bureaucracy is born. Laws are written. Leadership hierarchies evolve. Militaries are maintained. Taxes are invented. And urbanization begins. Getting food and water into the city and waste out of it becomes a concern. Workmen and builders evolve into planners, architects, and civil engineers. And so it goes. Civilizations are characterized by three essential features. First, the capacity for abstract language, unique to sapient species like our own, makes it possible to create enduring and complex social structures that are not tied to any specific individual. A social relation like parent or sibling or member of the tribe exists only so long as the individuals in the relation do. But an office like sheriff or president endures, while the people occupying the office come and go. A licensed marriage is more than a ritual and more than a personal relationship. It is a social contract entailing rights and privileges that are honored by the community. The terms of a trade agreement are enforceable by an authority that is not itself party to the contract, and so on. The second essential feature of civilizations is that they are problem-solving systems. Civilizations come into existence through this process, as we just saw, and the process never stops. Every civilization has its problems, most of them created as consequences of previous solutions to earlier problems. The third essential feature of civilizations is that they are dissipative structures. They depend, like all such structures, on a supply of exergy, that is, of useful energy, and the civilizations in turn are dynamically structured by the energy continually fluxing through them. And like all dissipative structures, they tend to evolve in ways that maximize the rate at which the available exergy is used. These three features, abstract language, problem-solving, and energy dynamics, don't exist in isolation from one another, but are dynamically integrated. As we saw in Chapter 2 of this video series, dynamical systems exhibit behaviors that are irreducibly complex, meaning that there is no simple formula or set of principles that would allow anyone either to predict or to control exactly how civilizations develop through time. Nature provides a close analogy to civilizations in the way that ecosystems develop. In ecosystems there are no abstractions, so they differ from civilizations in essential ways, but nevertheless we can see important parallels. When organisms evolve and differentiate into species,
they tend to do so in ways that best fit them for their environment. If a particular kind of food is abundant, species will evolve to make use of it. If a particular kind of predator is prevalent, species will evolve characteristics to enhance their survival against it. In this sense, ecosystems too are problem-solving systems. Over time, many species become interadapted to one another, forming a web of ecological relationships that is irreducibly complex. Ecosystems are also dissipative because they use and are in turn structured by the energy fluxing through them in the context of the physical environment. Consequently, they too tend to develop along pathways that maximize the use of energy for that environment.
Critically, ecosystems are never static. Ecologists discovered in the 20th century that ecosystems go through a sequence of stages called ecological succession.
Early organisms tend to be simple and fast-growing and differentiate quickly to take advantage of niches that develop, each exploiting a food source or an environmental feature in its own way. Over time, as complexity and competition increase, diversity also increases. Eventually, in a mature ecosystem, many species of microbial, plant, and animal life achieve an optimal balance, a balance that is maintained by the interdependencies of the species themselves. This is referred to as homeostasis, which essentially means self-maintaining. The upside of homeostasis is pretty obvious: a dynamic balance that supports the organisms in the system while optimizing their use of energy and resources. The downside of homeostasis is fragility. If nothing changed in the environment and no new species were introduced, either through mutation or invasion, then things might go along almost indefinitely. But of course, the environment is always changing. There are long-term cycles in the Earth's geophysical systems that bring about slow but continual changes in climate, in atmospheric and oceanic chemistry, and even in solar radiation levels. And organisms mutate. And there are meteors and volcanic eruptions. When conditions change, the homeostatic balance of a mature ecosystem is placed under stress, and at some point one or more species may fail. This throws homeostasis into disarray and a cascade of failures among the very interdependencies that made the ecosystem work, may cause its rapid decline and dissolution. Many species go extinct, others nearly so. This is the ecological version of complexity collapse. After this happens, the adaptive cycle always begins anew. Is there an adaptive cycle for civilizations? Yes, but the dynamics are different. Like ecosystems, civilizations evolve and adapt over time, optimizing and problem-solving, which is to say, they create complexity, a diversity of parts with many interdependencies. Like ecosystems, civilizations are homeostatic, that is, self-maintaining, and inevitably they maximize the rate at which they consume the available energy and resources. For these reasons, civilizations also exhibit fragility, with the consequence that when they lose homeostasis, failures cascade, resulting in a comparatively rapid complexity collapse. This observation is as old as the hills and even has a name, the Seneca effect, so named for this observation by the ancient Roman philosopher and statesman Seneca. Whatever structure has been reared by a long sequence of years, at the cost of great toil and through the great kindness of the gods, is scattered and dispersed by a single day. Increases are of sluggish growth, but the way to ruin is rapid.
Which brings us to the question that bedevils us all. Can collapse be avoided? To answer that question, we return to the essential features of civilization, the ones without which they would not exist.
Because they are dissipative, every civilization, like every organism, must have an energy capture strategy, one that meets metabolic needs over and above the energy cost of the energy captured. Because they are dynamically structured by the energy they capture, A failure of the energy capture strategy dooms a civilization to a complexity collapse irrespective of other factors. More broadly, every civilization, like every organism, is constrained by the physical and the ecological environment in which it exists. Energy is one physical resource. Our industrial system requires many other kinds, especially mineral resources, most of them of limited abundance. But perhaps the most important resources after energy are those covered by the term ecosystem services. These include all the renewable resources on which organized human activity depends, such as fresh water, fertile soil, waste processing, pollination of crops, and clement weather. The economic value of human activity worldwide is presently thought to be about $100 trillion. The economic value alone to humanity of the ecosystem services on which we depend is 4 or 5 times that at least.
If any one of these resources, energy, minerals, or ecosystem services, becomes unavailable in sufficient quantity, then civilization becomes unsustainable on its resource base. There's one thing we know about things that are unsustainable. They won't be sustained.
Issues of sustainability all come back to the fact that civilizations are dissipative. And we will explore all the sustainability issues in greater detail in future videos. But what about the other 2 essential features of civilization? We saw at the beginning of this video that civilizations are problem-solving systems. In his groundbreaking book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, anthropologist Joseph Tainter showed, from many historical examples, that when civilizations solve problems, the solutions generally involve an increase in complexity. This increased complexity may or may not involve a new technology, but either way it also consists in the creation of new abstract social roles and relations, together with new institutions that codify and administer them. My own profession was in academics, and this process is certainly very visible in that realm. When Title IX was passed into United States law, mandating equal support of women's athletics in educational settings, colleges had to respond by creating new administrative roles to oversee the implementation of that law in their own schools. New procedures with paperwork, record-keeping, and official reporting were invented to ensure accountability. Other examples in academia are legion, such as implementation of financial aid programs, curricular oversight, and so on. Schools that 100 years ago could house their administrations in a handful of offices now require large buildings, sometimes several of them, filled with deans, assistant deans, and administrative functionaries. Similar leaps in institutional complexity can be seen in all modern institutions, in government and in every sector of the economy. The flip side of this process is that when civilizations collapse, it is a collapse of complexity first and foremost. The institutions that codify and administer complex systems break down, leading to a delayering and simplifying of the processes of economic activity and social order. In some historical instances, this happened fairly gradually over many generations without too much drama. Very often, a civilization in decline was taken over by a stronger neighbor. In other cases, after a period of decline, there came a period of renewal, as the collapse of old institutions made room for the invention of new ones. In some cases, as we know and fear, historical collapses were comparatively rapid and caused catastrophic damage to society. Whether fast or slow, the mechanisms causing collapse are much the same. In the early stages of a civilization, increases in complexity bring with them great benefits as problems old and new get solved. The civilization's energy return on investment increases, sometimes substantially. However, as time goes by and complexity accumulates, 2 negative side effects of problem solving that were minor at first begin to grow in importance.
First, every increase in complexity increases the civilization's metabolic costs. Using the example of my own field of academia, new deans and their assistants must be paid. Their offices must be built, powered, heated and cooled, cleaned and maintained. And they need parking spaces, a constant source of strife on any campus. These are significant increases in the cost of running the institution, that is, in its metabolic costs.
This dynamic is constantly at work throughout any civilization. Each new road must be repaved at intervals. Each new machine means a new maintenance regime. Each new technology requires new specialties with new educational and professional organizations to support them. Each increase in population means more food is needed, and housing, and clothing, and schools, and hospitals, and services. Because metabolic costs increase with each new increase in complexity, those costs must eventually begin to approach the total energy available. In consequence, problem-solving itself has a problem, the problem of diminishing returns. Where early-stage problem-solving brought great marginal benefits, increasing the amount of excess energy available, late-stage problem-solving brings smaller and smaller marginal benefits. The second negative side effect is that any solution generally brings with it its own problems. Sometimes these can be solved, although these solutions, too, are likely to be accompanied by new problems, and we've already seen how this feeds the cycle of increasing complexity and metabolic costs.
But there's another issue. Not every problem has a solution. Problems with no solution become predicaments, and predicaments are commonplace.
Examples abound. Hierarchies foster oppression. Agriculture degrades ecosystems. Increases in complexity create social stresses. Technology depletes non-renewable resources, and so on. But when these two negative effects combine, diminishing returns and multiplying predicaments, we find that every civilization by its nature is driven toward crises in which ultimately it faces existential challenges that it is powerless to address.
And this brings us, finally, to the third essential feature of civilizations, the capacity for abstract language that allows us to create institutional complexities in the first place.
Because our institutions are abstract, they can only exist in virtue of both the understanding of the population concerning their nature and the assent of the population concerning their existence. A dollar bill only has value because people agree that it does. A prime minister is only prime minister because people say she is and act accordingly. Laws only keep the peace or ensure fair trade when people trouble to enforce them, because they understand their importance and believe in them.
In short, our institutions exist on faith and understanding. People tend to believe in their institutions only insofar as they believe that they function to their benefit. As predicaments accumulate and institutions fail to address them adequately, a frightful social dynamic sets in that involves two complementary features.
First, and obviously, if significant segments of the population cease to support institutions or even oppose them openly, the institutions suffer a crisis of legitimacy that further reduces their capacity to address the civilization's predicaments. The second, more insidious social effect is that when institutions become ineffective, the narratives that built them, the very language that defines them, is called into question. Opposing factions begin to adopt different meanings for the same words, and begin talking past one another, using narratives that have become irreconcilable.
We constantly get blamed as the haters. We came here in peace. We came here to keep security in this town for freedom of speech.
I came out here to support our people, you know what I'm saying? Not only, you know what I'm saying, people of color, but the people of this community, you know what I'm saying, that represent peace.
Fear and hate have been given license in our country. Violence, racialized violence has been given permission in this country, and we are here to stand for love.
Mutual intelligibility declines, and mutual suspicion and eventually hostility ensues. When this happens, the society, which had been of one mind in its identity as a people, loses its psychological unity, and institutions tumble, and chaos follows after. History shows us that it doesn't ultimately matter whether a system is autocratic and authoritarian or democratic and egalitarian. Without the agreement and cooperation of most of the citizenry, it will fall. Like the other dynamics of decline, this feature, too, was recognized long ago.
So where does that leave us? Civilizations are a particular kind of thing, and like all particular things, they have all the defects of their qualities.
As abstract, dissipative, problem-solving systems, they have a unique capacity to grow in complexity, to fully exploit the energy and other resources available to them, and to find creative and powerful solutions to the problems that beset them. These qualities themselves drive civilizations inexorably to resource exhaustion, to diminishing returns on complexity, and finally, to predicaments they cannot manage, failures that in turn cause the fracturing of the social narratives that hold them together. There are no 10,000-year-old civilizations for the same reason there are no 10-million-year-old ecosystems. That's not how the world works. There will almost certainly continue to be new ecosystems created for a very long time to come. Will there be new civilizations?
Nobody knows. I hope so.
Here the strictly theoretical part of this video series ends. We will turn now to the particulars of our own civilization and its collapse. We will examine all the aspects of civilizational collapse that were just reviewed, including energy decline, resource exhaustion, ecological overshoot, and the social stresses caused by our many grave predicaments. As we go on, don't forget to go back and look at the prologue again about why you shouldn't let collapse get you down. And as always, thank you for watching.
As predicaments accumulate, oh dear.
When you get famous, this can be part of our B-roll.
Yeah, right.